So each bronchi again undergoes repeated division to form the secondary and the tertiary bronchi. Each hemoglobin pigment is made up of 4 iron molecules, and each of these iron molecules is capable of carrying oxygen. There are some amphibians, some reptiles, birds and mammals that actually respire through lungs when they are on the land. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to a new session on a new chapter, that is breathing and exchange of gases. I'm Dr. Divya, Biology Faculty, Vidhyaashram University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So we all know that breathing is very important, right? Breathing is needed wherein we take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. And so far in the previous chapter, we had studied how oxygen is helpful for bringing about various metabolic activity. So if the biomacromolecules such as the carbohydrates, the proteins or the amino acids or the various nutrients or the glycerides, so various forms of compounds that are present in the food, if they have to be broken down into simpler forms, then oxygen is needed. Not just that, for various other metabolic activity to occur properly in our body, oxygen is very important. So in today's session, we shall study about the different respiratory organs and the respiratory system in humans. So to begin with, let us study about the respiratory organs. So we all know that in human beings, we have a pair of lungs that help in the process of respiration, right? So like that, in other organisms also, the respiration is facilitated by various organs. So we shall study about the mechanism of breathing in different groups of animals. So the lower invertebrates, so some of the lower invertebrates such as the sponges, then some of the coelenterate, the flatworms, etc., they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide by a simple diffusion process. So here the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place by a simple diffusion process wherein the respiration occurs in their entire body surface. So we can see we have taken the example of here the sponges. So sponges, then we have the flatworm. Then this is jellyfish, which is the best example for coelenterate members. The jellyfish. So all these three, they respire through their entire body. They don't have a specific organ like how we have. We have lungs, right? Just like that, the amphibians and the fishes, they have the gills. But these organisms, that is some of the invertebrates, they do not have respiratory organs. They can breathe or exchange gases throughout their body. So by a simple diffusion process. So next, moving on to earthworms. So earthworms have on their skin, they have a very moist covering which is called as the cuticle, and they use their moist cuticle, and also they have a network of tubules or tracheal tubules to transport atmospheric air within the body. So earthworms, they breathe through their skin. So they have a cuticle which is very moist, and that moist cuticle actually helps in the exchange of gases. And not just that, even they have some of the insects, they have a network of tubes called as the tracheal tubes that actually help in the transport of gases within the body. So this is how different organisms respire. So next, talking about the aquatic arthropods and the mollusks. So aquatic arthropods, so we have taken the example of an arthropod here. So these aquatic organisms, we all know that the aquatic organisms, usually they use their gills, right? So we have aquatic arthropods, then we have a mollusk here. So mollusks, all these, they use gills, which are nothing but, which is called as branchial respiration. As is human beings, we have pulmonary respiration wherein we use the lungs. So these organisms, that is the aquatic arthropods and the mollusks, since they live in water, they use gills, and such type of respiration is called as the branchial respiration. Next, talking about the terrestrial forms. So the terrestrial forms, they have specialized structures called as the vascularized bags. So they have specialized structures which looks like the vascularized bags, and these vascularized bags help in taking enough oxygen, storing the oxygen and giving out the carbon dioxide, and they are called as the lungs, and therefore it is a pulmonary respiration. So we use most of the mammals and all that, including the humans, we use lungs for respiration. That is, almost all the terrestrial forms, they use vascularized bag-like structures called as lungs for the respiration, and such type of respiration is called as the pulmonary respiration. And next, moving on to some other organisms such as the vertebrates. So vertebrates, for example, fishes. So fishes, they entirely live in water, right? So therefore they use gills. But whereas amphibians live in water as well as on land. So when they are in water, these amphibians, or we can say that if they are in water, they respire through specialized structures that they have, and also they respire through skin, some of the amphibians. But whereas there are some amphibians, some reptiles, birds and mammals that actually respire through lungs when they are on the land. Amphibians, frogs, when they are on the land, they use lungs for respiration. And birds, mammals and reptiles also use lungs for respiration, whereas the fishes, they use gills for the respiration. And amphibians like frogs, they can respire through their moist skin, and such a respiration is called as cutaneous respiration. So cutane or cuticle means the skin. So if a respiration occurs through the skin, it is called as the cutaneous respiration. So you can see here, I've taken the example of a mammal here, that is cat, which can respire through the lungs. Then we have various, that is fishes. Fishes respire through the gills, and also the frogs, they respire through lungs when they are on land, and when they are in water, they respire through moist skin. And there are certain reptiles also which respire skin, and also the birds respire through the lungs. So these are some of the examples of different types of respiratory organs that are present in the different animals. So moving on to the human respiratory system. So this chapter completely deals with the respiration process that occurs in the human beings. So when we talk about human respiratory system, we have to talk right from our nose till our lungs. So what all happens, how the exchange of gases occurs, all these we need to understand. So if we need to understand the process of exchange of gases, it is very important for us to learn about the different structures that are present in the respiratory system. So we shall study about the human respiratory system. It begins with the nostrils. So when you see our nose, you can see two openings, right? So those openings are nothing but the nostrils. So it is through these nostrils actually the air enters into our lungs. So nostrils. So we human beings, we have a pair of external nostrils which are nothing but openings that are present above our upper lip. So they are the openings that are present above the upper lips. And inside the nostril, when you take a look inside the nostril, you can find the nasal chamber. So this nasal chamber and the nostril actually leads to the nasal chamber through the nasal passage. This nasal passage leads to the pharynx. So the nasal chamber or the nasal passage opens into the pharynx, which is a portion of which is the common passage for food and air, right? When we were studying about digestion, we studied pharynx is a common passage for food and air. But when it comes to air, it moves into the trachea. When it comes to food, the food moves into the esophagus. But first, both the air and the food, it passes through the pharynx itself. Next is the larynx. So the pharynx opens through the larynx region and then into the trachea. So these are the different parts. So talking about, first comes the nasal cavity, that is the opening. Through the opening we have the nasal passage, then comes the pharynx, and the pharynx leads to the larynx. So we can see even here as well. So what are there in the pharynx? We shall see what all is there in the pharynx. So you can see the nasopharynx. The oropharynx is a mouth cavity. It is the oropharynx. Nasopharynx is the nose passage that leads to the pharynx. That is the nasopharynx. The mouth passage that leads to the pharynx will be the oropharynx. And next, these nasopharynx and the oropharynx leads into the laryngopharynx. These laryngopharynx or the larynx later on divides into trachea and then into the esophagus. Through the trachea, the air enters. Through the esophagus, the food enters. And all that we have studied. While eating food, there is something called as the epiglottis, which will block the trachea, therefore preventing the entry of food into the trachea. So all that we have studied in the process of digestion. So next, moving on to the other parts, that is, we'll study in detail about the larynx. So larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps, it is also called as the sound box. That is a region which actually generates sound when we are talking. So larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps in the production of sound, and therefore it is also called as the sound box. So when we are swallowing food, what happens? The glottis can be covered. I have already told you, the glottis or the trachea gets covered by a thin elastic cartilaginous flap called as the epiglottis. Why should the epiglottis be present? Because breathing will never stop, right? Breathing of course stops. It is said that breathing stops for just a second or so when we are sneezing. It is a fact that I have read somewhere, right? But here what happens, when we are eating food, breathing will not stop. So if the breathing doesn't stop, means the trachea also tends to be open, esophagus also tends to be open. But what happens here is, for the food particles to not enter into the trachea, in the tracheal region there will be a small flap that is present which will open and close. It will be open when we are not having food, and when we are swallowing food it will close so that the food particles will not interfere. And this flap will not interfere with the breathing process as well. So that flap is called as the epiglottis to prevent entry of food into the larynx. So as you can see here, we have the nasal passage leads to the pharynx leads into the larynx, and the larynx leads to the trachea. And in the trachea, you can see somewhere in the trachea here, there will be a small flap-like structure which will prevent the entry of food passing through the esophagus into the trachea. Then it leads to the lungs. So the trachea then leads or branches to form the bronchus, and the bronchus further branches to form the secondary and the tertiary branches to form the bronchiole. So this is about the larynx which bears the trachea. Next, talking about the trachea. So trachea is a straight tube. It is a straight tube, like how esophagus is a straight tube. Just like that, trachea is also a straight tube, and the trachea extends up to the mid-thoracic cavity. So as you can see here, this trachea extends up to the mid-thoracic cavity, and then it will branch. And then it divides at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae into a right and left primary bronchi. So as you can see here, this is the bronchus. So one single one, bronchus. So it divides into the left primary bronchi and the right primary bronchi. So it divides into the left and the right primary bronchi. These left and right primary bronchi then further divide. So we shall study about the bronchi. So bronchi, so from where did the bronchi arise? The trachea, which was a long slender tube, when it reached the fifth segment of the thoracic cavity, it got divided into two primary bronchi, that is the left primary bronchi and the right primary bronchi. So each bronchi again undergoes repeated division to form the secondary and the tertiary bronchi. So you can see here, again they divide. So this left bronchi, again it divides to form the secondary, I'll just write it here, secondary bronchi and then the tertiary bronchi. So that is how they branch. So the bronchi, primary bronchi divides to form the secondary bronchi divides to form the tertiary bronchi, just like how branching occurs in a tree, exactly like that. And they end to form bronchioles, and the bronchioles ending up with in very thin terminal bronchioles. So after tertiary formation of the tertiary bronchi, they end up in forming very thin bronchioles. So this is the structure of the trachea and the bronchi. So next, talking in detail about the respiratory system. So the trachea, the primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi and the tertiary bronchi and the initial bronchioles that are there, all are supported by cartilaginous ring-like structures. If you can see here, they are supported by, so you can see the trachea and then you can see the primary bronchi. This is the primary bronchi, this primary bronchi and the secondary bronchi, and to some extent the tertiary bronchi also, all are supported by ring-like structures. If you can see here, you can see ring-like structures around, right? So these ring-like structures are nothing but cartilaginous or soft bones. They are made up of soft bones and they are called as the cartilaginous ring. So why are these cartilaginous rings present is because one is to offer protection and the other one is to maintain the shape of the trachea when we are breathing in and breathing out air. So for that particular reason. So each terminal bronchiole give rise to a number of very thin, irregularly walled and vascularized bag-like structures called alveoli. So you can see small grape-like structures at the end, right? So all these small grape-like structure. So all these are nothing but called as the alveoli. So they are at the end, very thin bronchioles. So bronchioles are the end of the tertiary bronchi. So these bronchioles again end in formation of small circular-like structures, that is bag-like structures, that is they are thin-walled, they have very thin-walled, they are vascularized bag-like structures which are called as the alveoli. And the branching network of bronchi as well as bronchioles and alveoli, they comprise the lungs. So what is the lungs made up of? In the lungs, what are the different parts, respiratory parts that are present? They are nothing but a part of the primary bronchi, then the secondary bronchi, the tertiary bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, all that reside inside the lungs. So this is about the complete picture of the lungs. Inside the lungs, what are the different parts of the respiratory organ system that are present. So next, moving on to talking about the lungs. So usually we have two lungs, right? We have a pair of lungs. So we have two lungs and these lungs are covered by a double layered membrane which is called as the pleura, and in between these pleura they have a pleural fluid. So as you can see here, we have two lungs. One is the left one, the right lobe and the left lobe. So two lungs are there and we can see a pleura, that is this one, the pleura, that is the outer covering of the lung is called as the pleura. So it is covered by two pleura, the outer pleura and the inner pleura. In between the two pleuras, you can see the pleural fluid. So in between the two pleuras, there is filled a fluid-like substance which is called as the pleural fluid. So this pleural fluid is very, very important because it is the one that actually reduces the friction on the lung surface. And the outer pleural membrane is in close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in close contact with the lung surface. That is true, right? The outer pleural membrane is in contact with the thorax, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lungs. So that is about the pleura or the covering of the lungs. So the lungs are two in number. Each lung is covered by two pleural membranes. The outer pleural membrane is in contact with the thorax, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with the lungs, and the two pleural membranes, gap between the two pleural membranes are filled with the pleural fluid. So much is about the lungs. And the part starting with the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles constitute the conducting part. So this is the conducting part, right? Right from a nostril up to a bronchiole is the conducting part, because we conduct air, we take in air and then we deliver it to the lungs. So that is why it is the conducting part. Next function is with the lungs. So whereas the alveoli and their ducts form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. So the conduction part, that is the taking in of air, the giving out of air, and all that is done by our nostril. Right from the nostril up to our bronchioles, all that is done. That is the conduction of air is done. Next, the process of, that is exchange of the air, that actually takes place by the alveoli and the ducts. So it is the exchange part, the conductive part are the bronchioles, the nostrils, then comes the nasal passage, then comes the pharynx, the trachea, then comes the primary and the secondary branch, then the tertiary branch. All these are the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and the ducts and their ducts or the tube-like structures of the alveoli that are there, they form the respiratory part. So the conducting parts, what is the function of the conducting part? So the conducting part, it actually transports the atmospheric air to the alveoli. So whatever air the alveoli has to receive for the exchange of air, that will be transported to the alveoli by the conducting part. And also the conducting part clears all the air from foreign particles. That is true, right? Inside a nostril, we have fine hair-like structures that prevents the entry of dust into a nasal passage. So it clears the foreign particles and it humidifies. Also, it keeps the nasal passage moist and also brings air to the body temperature. So all this is the function of the conducting part. First function is it delivers the air to the alveoli for further process. Next function is it makes sure that the air entering into our nasal passage is free of dust and foreign particles. The third function is it humidifies the air, and the fourth function is it makes sure that the air that we take in is of our body temperature itself. And also next talking about the exchange part, that is the alveoli and its ducts. So the alveoli and its ducts is the actual site for the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. That is for the giving of oxygen to the blood and the carbon dioxide from the blood. That is the exchange of respiratory gases between the lungs and the blood is done by the alveoli and that of its ducts, which are called as the exchange parts. That is between the blood and also the atmospheric air. So all this is about the conducting part and respiratory part. Because we know about all this now, it will be easy for us to understand the actual respiration process. So we understood what the conducting part is and what the respiratory part is. So let us move on to the steps that are involved in respiration. So breathing, or it is pulmonary respiration, right? Because we make use of the lungs for respiration. So therefore breathing is also called as the pulmonary respiration or the pulmonary ventilation. So the pulmonary ventilation by which atmospheric air is drawn in. We draw in atmospheric air. In that atmospheric air, what do we draw in? We draw in only oxygen. So atmospheric air is drawn in and the carbon dioxide rich alveolar air is released out. Atmospheric air is drawn in, it will enter into the alveoli will give it to the blood, and from the blood the carbon dioxide will be taken in and the carbon dioxide will enter through the alveoli and it will be given back. So that is the first step that occurs in the respiration. And during this diffusion of gases, that is diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across alveolar membrane. So one more step is it helps in the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the alveolar membrane, and also it helps in the transport of gases by the blood. So blood contains hemoglobin pigment, and each hemoglobin pigment is made up of 4 iron molecules, and each of these iron molecule is capable of carrying oxygen. So therefore blood is the transporter of oxygen. Next step in respiration is the transport of the gases by the blood. Next step is diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and tissues. Next is the oxygen will be given to the blood. The blood will take in the oxygen. It will carry the oxygen to the tissues, and whatever carbon dioxide is there in the tissues, the blood will collect it and bring it back. So that is the next step. Next is utilization of the oxygen by the cells. So the oxygen, as soon as the blood reaches the cells or the tissues, the cells will make use of the oxygen for various catabolic reaction, and therefore it will release the carbon dioxide. How does the carbon dioxide get released? The cells will give the carbon dioxide to the blood will bring back the carbon dioxide, give it to the alveoli will collect it, and then again through the tracheal passage it will be left out and through the nostrils it will be left out to the external environment. So this is actually how the process of breathing occurs. So see how many 5 steps are involved. But when we are breathing in air, we'll never realize that so much process is occurring, right? Very easily we breathe in and breathe out. But so much process in that second or minute of breathing in and breathing out, so much process would have occurred inside the human respiratory system. So much process would have occurred inside the human respiratory system. Now, since you know about the different respiratory organs and you know at least a little about the steps involved in the respiration, in the next coming session, we can easily study and understand about the human respiratory system. What is the exact process? How exactly the exchange of gases take place? All that. So, we shall meet again in the coming session. Thank you.